Let me be direct with you right now. What is being sold to you as a ceasefire is not a ceasefire. It is a restructuring. And if you don't understand the difference between those two words, you are going to wake up in 6 months completely blindsided by what comes next. So stay with me because I am going to break down exactly what is happening, who designed it, who benefits from it, and why the word peace is being used as a cover story for something that has nothing to do with peace at all. Let's start with the most basic question that almost nobody in mainstream media is asking. What does a ceasefire actually mean in the language of American geopolitical strategy? Because in the dictionary, a ceasefire means both sides stop shooting. Simple, clean, neutral. But in Washington's playbook, and this has been true since at least the 1990s, a ceasefire means one side agrees to stop defending itself while the other side consolidates the gains it has already made. That is not semantics. That is the actual operational definition of how American brokered ceasefires have functioned for the last 30 years. Go look at the history. Every single time, the party that is winning militarily is asked to pause. The party that is losing politically is given time to regroup, rearm, and reframe the narrative. And the broker, always America, always with Wall Street money somewhere in the background, walks away with contracts, access, and leverage that did not exist before the shooting started. Now Trump is back. And immediately, within months of returning to the White House, we have this dramatic headline-dominating push for a ceasefire in not one, but multiple theaters simultaneously. Ukraine, Gaza, signals about Iran, murmurs about Taiwan, all of it landing on your screen at the same time, all of it wrapped in the language of deal making, of strength, of Trump, the negotiator, coming in to clean up Biden's mess. And look, I understand why that framing is appealing. People are exhausted. Real people, working people, people who are watching their grocery bills go up while their government sends another $100 billion overseas. Those people want this to stop. That desire is completely legitimate. But here is what you have to understand. The people designing this ceasefire are not responding to your exhaustion. They are exploiting it. Think about who is actually in the room when these deals get structured. It is not historians. It is not diplomats who specialize in post-conflict reconstruction. It is financiers. It is private equity. It is the same class of people who looked at Iraq after 2003 and saw not a humanitarian catastrophe, but a privatization opportunity. The same people who looked at Greece in 2010 and said, yes, this is a debt crisis, and the solution is to sell off the ports, the airports, the public utilities, the entire productive infrastructure of a sovereign nation to satisfy creditors who made bad bets and expected the population to cover the losses. That is the template. That has always been the template. And what you are watching right now, dressed up in Trump's signature negotiating theater, is that template being applied on a scale we have not seen before. And if you think I'm being dramatic about this, stay with me, because the next part of what I'm going to show you is the financial architecture underneath this ceasefire push. And once you see it, you will not be able to unsee it. Let's talk about Ukraine specifically, because that is where the template is most visible right now. The official story is straightforward. Russia invaded, the West responded with sanctions and military aid. Ukraine heroically resisted, and now Trump is stepping in to negotiate a settlement because the war has ground to a stalemate and nobody can afford to keep funding it indefinitely. That is the story. But let me give you the version with the financial subtext included, because that is the version that actually explains what is happening. Ukraine, before this war intensified, had some of the most fertile agricultural land on the planet. It had significant mineral resources. It had industrial infrastructure, a large educated workforce, and a geographic position that made it enormously valuable as a transit corridor for energy and trade. It also had, by the time the war accelerated, accumulated somewhere between $100 and $150 billion in external debt, depending on how you count it, with more being added every month that the conflict continued. Now ask yourself a simple question. When this war ends, whenever and however it ends, who owns that debt? Who has the legal claim on Ukraine's future economic output? Who gets to sit at the table and say, before you rebuild a single bridge or school or power plant, you owe us, and here is what we want in return? The International Monetary Fund has already been in Ukraine throughout this entire conflict. The World Bank has been there. American private equity firms have already been quietly positioning themselves in Ukrainian agricultural land through various legal structures that were made possible by land reform legislation passed under pressure from Western creditors in 2021. This is not speculation. This is documented. And what a ceasefire does, what it does structurally, regardless of whoever's name is on it, is it converts a war economy into a reconstruction economy. And in the reconstruction economy, the people who hold the debt hold the power. Trump understands deals. He will tell you that himself endlessly. But here is what he either does not say or does not fully reckon with. Not all deals are made at the negotiating table. Some of the most important deals are made in the fine print of debt restructuring agreements 3 years after the cameras have moved on. Some of the most important deals are made when an exhausted, destroyed country has no leverage left and will sign anything that promises to turn the lights back on. That is not a Trump deal. That is a Wall Street deal. And Trump, whether he knows it or not, whether he intends it or not, is creating the conditions for exactly that kind of deal to happen. But here's where it gets even more complicated. And this is the part that directly connects to your life, your savings, your economic future. So don't go anywhere because I'm just getting to the core of it. Let's zoom out for a moment because Ukraine is not happening in isolation. It is happening inside a much larger geopolitical and financial realignment that has been building for years. You have the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now a growing list of others, actively trying to build an alternative to the dollar-based financial system that has given the United States its extraordinary power to run deficits, impose sanctions, and essentially tax the rest of the world through the mechanisms of reserve currency status and dollar-denominated debt. You have China and Russia deepening their economic integration in ways that were almost unthinkable a decade ago. You have the global South, country after country, quietly, carefully, beginning to ask whether the Western-led financial order has actually served their development or whether it has served the development of Western creditors at their expense. And into this moment, this genuinely pivotal, historically significant moment of realignment, comes Trump's ceasefire push. Now, why now? Because the timing is not accidental. The United States is facing a situation where it cannot militarily or financially sustain the current level of confrontation on multiple fronts simultaneously. The sanctions on Russia have not collapsed the Russian economy. They have, if anything, accelerated Russia's reorientation toward non-Western trade partners and away from dollar dependency. The military support for Ukraine has drained American stockpiles and revealed uncomfortable limitations in American industrial capacity. And the political support at home among the working class voters who actually put Trump back in the White House for continuing to write blank checks to foreign governments is evaporating. So what does a smart power do when it realizes it has overextended? It does not simply retreat. That would be a loss and a visible one. What it does is it reframes the retreat as a negotiation. It reframes the withdrawal as a deal, and it tries to lock in as many structural advantages as possible before the leverage disappears entirely. That is what you are watching. This ceasefire push is America trying to freeze the board at a moment when the board is not moving in America's favor, while simultaneously using the promise of reconstruction finance and debt relief to establish long-term economic control over the countries that will depend on Western capital to rebuild. And the part that should make you genuinely angry, if you are an ordinary person who works for a living and pays taxes and has been told for years that there is no money for healthcare or infrastructure or education, is that the money being used to establish this economic control is ultimately your money. It is borrowed in your name against your future taxes and deployed on behalf of financial interests that will profit from the reconstruction contracts, the debt service payments, and the privatization deals that flow from a ceasefire that was never really about peace. Stick with me, I'm going to show you exactly how the Gaza dimension of this connects to everything I just laid out, why the dollar itself is at the center of all of this, and what this means for where we go from here. This is where it all comes together. Now let's talk about Gaza. Because what is happening in Gaza is not separate from what is happening in Ukraine. It is not a different story with different logic and different actors. It is the same story. It is the same financial and geopolitical architecture operating in a different geography. And if you do not see the connection, you are looking at two pieces of the same puzzle and thinking they belong to different boxes. Let me put the picture together for you, because once you see it whole, the Trump ceasefire push stops looking like diplomacy and starts looking like exactly what it is: a strategic repositioning by an empire that is trying to manage its own decline while making sure the right people profit from the transition. Start with the basic geography. Gaza sits on the eastern Mediterranean coast. Directly offshore, and this is not a secret, this has been reported and documented, there are significant natural gas deposits: the Leviathan field, the Gaza Marine field, other reserves in the broader Eastern Mediterranean basin. These are not trivial. These are billions of dollars worth of energy resources that, under any normal framework of international law, would belong to the people of Gaza and the Palestinian people more broadly. Now, ask yourself the question you are supposed to ask whenever resources are involved in a conflict. Who currently has access to those resources? Who wants access to those resources? And who is being removed from the equation so that access can be secured? Because that question, followed honestly to its answer, tells you more about what is actually happening in Gaza than anything you will hear in a mainstream news broadcast. The ceasefire conversations around Gaza have followed a pattern that should be familiar to anyone who paid attention to what I just told you about Ukraine. There is a dramatic escalation of violence. There is international outcry. There is a period of American diplomatic activity that is loudly described as pursuing peace. And then there is a proposed settlement that, beneath the humanitarian language, contains provisions about governance, about economic administration, about who controls the port, who controls the airspace, who controls the financial flows in and out of the territory. Every single time, the settlement framework that emerges from American brokered negotiations happens to align with the economic and strategic interests of American allies and American connected financial institutions. Every single time. At some point, you have to stop calling that a coincidence and start calling it a policy. And what I'm about to connect for you right now is the thread that runs from Gaza through Ukraine all the way to your bank account and the value of the money in your wallet. So stay with me, because this is the part that actually changes how you see the world. Let's talk about the dollar. Because ultimately, everything I have described, the Ukraine reconstruction play, the Gaza resource question, the ceasefire theater, is downstream of one central fact of global economic life, which is that the United States dollar is the world's reserve currency, and that status is the source of an almost incomprehensible amount of American power and American privilege. When you are the country that issues the currency that everyone else needs to buy oil, to service their debts, to conduct international trade, you can do things that no other country can do. You can run permanent trade deficits and not face the consequences that would destroy any other economy. You can impose sanctions that function as economic weapons because you control the plumbing of the global financial system. You can borrow essentially without limit because there is always demand for your currency and your debt instruments. This is what the economist Barry Eichengreen called the exorbitant privilege, and it is not an exaggeration. But here is the thing about privilege. It depends on everyone else accepting it. And what has been happening slowly and then with increasing speed over the last decade is that more and more countries have been deciding that the costs of accepting American dollar dominance outweigh the benefits. When you watch Russia and China settling bilateral trade in their own currencies, when you watch Saudi Arabia beginning to accept yuan for oil sales, when you watch country after country in Africa and Latin America quietly exploring alternatives to the SWIFT payment system that America has weaponized through sanctions, what you are watching is the slow, grinding, historically inevitable erosion of the foundation on which American global power rests. Trump understands this at some level. His entire economic nationalism framework, the tariffs, the bring manufacturing back rhetoric, the hostility toward multilateral institutions, reflects an intuition that America has been giving away too much and getting too little in return. And that intuition is not entirely wrong. The American working class has genuinely been hollowed out by the same financialization process that enriched Wall Street. The deindustrialization is real. The trade deficits are real. The sense that ordinary Americans are subsidizing a global system that benefits everyone except them, that feeling has a basis in economic reality. But here is where Trump's diagnosis and his prescription diverge in a way that should worry you deeply. Because the answer to dollar decline is not tariffs and deal-making theater. The answer, if there even is one at this stage, would require a fundamental restructuring of who the American economy actually serves. And that is the conversation that neither Trump nor his financial backers have any interest in having. Because what's coming next, and I mean in the next 2 to 3 years, not some distant hypothetical, is a dollar crisis that will make everything I've described so far look like a warm-up act. Let me show you why. The numbers here are not abstract. The United States is carrying a national debt that is now well over $30 trillion and growing by roughly $2 trillion per year. The interest payments alone on that debt are now the single largest line item in the federal budget, surpassing defense spending, surpassing Social Security in terms of trajectory. And as interest rates have risen from the near zero levels that prevailed for over a decade following the 2008 financial crisis, the cost of servicing that debt has exploded in ways that are genuinely unsustainable by any honest accounting. At the same time, the foreign demand for American Treasury bonds, the mechanism by which the United States has been able to export its debt to the rest of the world and receive real goods and services in return, is weakening. China has been reducing its Treasury holdings. Japan, the other major foreign holder, is under its own financial pressure. The marginal buyer for American debt is increasingly the Federal Reserve itself, which means the United States is, in a meaningful sense, printing money to pay its own bills and dressing it up in the technical language of monetary policy so that people do not recognize it for what it is. Now, connect that to the ceasefire story. When the United States brokers a ceasefire and positions itself as the indispensable architect of whatever reconstruction follows, what it is really doing is trying to create new economic dependencies that reinforce dollar demand. Ukraine rebuilds with dollar-denominated loans. Gaza reconstruction, if and when it comes, gets financed through dollar-denominated instruments controlled by American-aligned institutions. The countries that cooperate with the American framework get access to capital markets and trade relationships. The countries that resist get sanctions, regime change pressure, and financial isolation. This is the system. This has been the system. And the ceasefire is not a departure from the system. It is the system operating at full capacity, using the language of peace to achieve objectives that could not be achieved through continued open conflict. The tragedy, and I use that word deliberately, is that real people are dying in these conflicts. Real children, real families, real communities that have existed for generations and are being destroyed in conflicts that are, at their deepest level, about the interests of financial elites who will never spend a single night in a bomb shelter. The human cost of what I am describing is not an abstraction to me, and I do not want it to be an abstraction to you. But I also believe that the best way to honor the suffering of the people caught in these conflicts is to be completely honest about what is driving them, because you cannot solve a problem you are not willing to correctly diagnose. And this is exactly where it connects to your life, not just theirs. So don't tune out now, because the last piece of this puzzle is the one that hits closest to home. What does all of this mean for you? Not for geopolitical analysts, not for think tank fellows. For you personally, economically, in terms of the life you are trying to build or hold together right now, here is what it means. The financial system that is being defended and extended through these ceasefire arrangements is the same financial system that has been transferring wealth upward in your country for 40 years. It is the same system that bailed out the banks in 2008 and told you there was no money for mortgage relief. It is the same system that found trillions of dollars for quantitative easing, for pumping up asset prices that benefited people who already owned assets, while telling working people that Social Security was unaffordable and that wages simply could not rise faster without causing inflation. Every foreign policy decision, every military intervention, every sanctions regime, every ceasefire negotiation that extends American financial dominance is also a decision about who wins and who loses inside the American economy. When the United States borrows $2 trillion a year to fund its deficit, and a significant portion of that is going to military spending and foreign financial operations, the cost of that borrowing is carried by everyone who uses dollars. It shows up in inflation. It shows up in interest rates that make mortgages unaffordable and car loans crushing and credit card debt a permanent feature of working class life. The empire does not pay for itself out of some abstract imperial treasury. It is paid for by the gradual erosion of your purchasing power and the systematic underfunding of every public good that your life actually depends on. Trump is not going to change this, not because he is uniquely corrupt, though the conflicts of interest around his business dealings and his policy decisions are real and documented, but because the structural pressures that produce these outcomes are larger than any individual president. The financialization of the American economy, the dominance of Wall Street over productive industry, the use of foreign policy as an instrument of financial extraction, these are not bugs in the system. They are features. They are what the system is designed to produce. And a ceasefire that extends that system into new territories, that opens new populations to the discipline of dollar-denominated debt, is not a step toward a more peaceful world. It is a step toward a more efficiently extracted one. And here's the final thing I want to leave you with, because understanding this last point is the difference between being a passive victim of these processes and being someone who actually sees clearly enough to navigate what's coming. The one genuine wild card in all of this, the factor that the architects of this system are most afraid of, is the accelerating de-dollarization. Because if the dollar loses its reserve currency status, not all at once, but gradually and then suddenly, the way Hemingway described going bankrupt, then the entire mechanism I have been describing collapses. The United States can no longer export its inflation. It can no longer borrow without consequence. It can no longer use financial sanctions as a weapon without destroying the weapon in the process. And the ceasefires and the reconstruction deals and the debt traps all lose their leverage because the currency that denominated the debt is no longer the currency that everyone needs. That is why the BRICS expansion is such a serious development and why it gets so little serious coverage in Western media. That is why the moves toward alternative payment systems are being watched with genuine alarm in Washington and on Wall Street, even as they are dismissed publicly as ineffectual. The people who benefit from the current system know exactly how dependent it is on continued global dollar acceptance, and they are watching that acceptance erode in real time. The ceasefire push, all of it, Ukraine and Gaza, and the broader diplomatic theater, needs to be understood in that context. It is a system under pressure, trying to lock in as many advantages as possible before the underlying architecture shifts. You are living through one of those rare historical moments when the fundamental structure of global economic and political power is actually changing. Those moments are disorienting and dangerous, and they are also the moments when clarity matters most. The people who understand what is actually happening can make better decisions about where to put their savings, about who to trust, about what political narratives are actually serving their interests versus which ones are managing them. The people who are still watching the puppet show and thinking they are watching the news are going to be caught completely off guard by what comes next. So no, Trump's ceasefire is not a peace plan. It is a positioning strategy inside a larger competition for control of the post-unipolar world order. It is America trying to trade active military and financial commitments for structural economic advantages before its leverage runs out completely. Whether it succeeds or fails, the ordinary people on the ground in Ukraine and Gaza and everywhere else that becomes a theater of this competition will pay the price. And the ordinary people in the United States will pay their own version of that price through the continued degradation of their economic lives in service of a financial empire that stopped working for them a very long time ago. That is the real plan. Now you know it. Share this with someone who needs to hear it.